want to be able to see it. And we just want to make sure everyone knows it's being recorded. So, you know, and then I think the other piece of Zoom etiquette I've learned is that when you private message one another in the chat box, Robin will be able to see it all. It won't end up in the recording, but Robin will know what you texted, you chatted with each other about. So, not that it would be inappropriate in any way, but we're all learning Zoom etiquette. So, you all know me. I live here in the southwest corner of Colorado, and I live here very intentionally. I came to Colorado in 1993 as an undergraduate. By 1994, I started my PhD at University of Colorado Boulder. And in 1996, I was having a beer at Carver's in downtown Durango, and I overheard somebody say there was a college. I was like, there's a college here? And then, you know, I still had to finish a PhD. I had to do postdoctoral work. I had to do all the things that that are required in order to then work towards the position you want in the place you want. And that's a piece of resilience, and a piece of this story too that I'm going to share with you today, is it's not just about what we do. It's about who we know and where we live, and the passion and commitment we bring within our communities that creates the resilience. So I wanted to start with a little bit where you didn't have to look at a PowerPoint, and now we're going to switch to the PowerPoint mode. So hopefully I've done a good job in creating some strong visuals and some stories that I'd like to tell you. So I never gave Robin a title. So Resilient People, Resilient Planet is the title I came up with. And I'm on social media at Heidi Mountains. And if at any point you want to text the link for this talk, text the Zoom link, or tweet, sorry, or however you want to do it, you can also tag at Heidi Mountains, and that'll get out to some folks. So a welcome. Happy Earth Day. It's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and to me that's a little bit shocking. I'm 48 years old, in case you all didn't know, and so Earth Day is my life. Like, Earth Day is the time period over which I was born and have grown into an adult, and there's so much change that's happened. So much change on our planet that we never expected, and increased awareness, growing awareness all the time of where and how we can grow our understanding of human history and social change, as well as the environmental change. So with that, I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land where we live are the ancestral lands of and territories of the Ute, the Apache, the Pueblo, Hopi, Zuni, and Dene Nation. At Fort Lewis College, we use this land acknowledgement to thank everyone for respecting and acknowledging the history of the region that we live in. Added to that, I want to share the sentiment that there are many people who are experiencing challenging times across our region, and with that, bring awareness to it. When people are facing hardships, economic hardships because of the stay-home measures, health hardships because of the virus, the first step is to acknowledge that and say, we're sorry that there are hard things going on, and offer our opportunities to help one another. And I'm honored to live in this region and have that opportunity to be part of communities that are so good at helping one another. I went here. I'm not sure you could guess where this is, because most people never go here. And that was part of why I wanted to go here. This is the Western Brooks Range. This is in Noatak National Park. I'm a bush flight, 45-minute bush flight away from the nearest town, and the nearest town is an Inuit city, or Inuit town of about 5,000 people. Kotzebue is the name of that town. And I was given several choices for what to do post-PhD. I was 27 years old when I decided that I would go here. And the other choices that were available to me were to work with more prestigious research groups and to work in places where there were lots of people. And by lots of people, lots of researchers, and lots of people who had a plan for what they were going to do. And the landscape was less wide open, less studied. or more studied in those other places. And what I really wanted to do was go a place where almost nobody had done any science. There was something different about going to a landscape that was hard to access, and I was fortunate to get funded through the US Geological Survey to be able to work here. And so that this photo includes no people is because I spent a summer with no people. There were two people, two field staff that were with me, but it was the three of us out here in a landscape where what brought us there was what you see in this picture, a land with almost no trees and increasing trees across the landscape. And we were trying to understand, how much does it matter that a place that hasn't had trees now has trees? To show you where that is, that triangle that you see, sort of central in the United States part of this picture, is where we were. So we're north of the Seward Peninsula. We were near the Chukchi Sea, and the Chukchi Sea is a very defining part of the region and the community that we were flying in and out of. And we were really close to Russia. And when you look at the world map that's down in the right-hand corner, world maps always make it look like Alaska isn't near Russia, but Alaska's really close to Russia in actuality. And so we couldn't say that we could see Russia. And I know that that's sort of, something that folks have joked about in Alaska before, is we can see Russia, but you can't, at least not from where we were. But we were tucked away back in the Brooks Range. To give you another sense of where we were in that red dot, where that red dot is that's on this map and off to the left. The red dot towards the middle of the map is where Robert Marshall went to do explorations of the Brooks Range back in the 50s. So one of the motivations for being a scientist is to go places others don't go, to be present in landscapes where we can feel connected to the land, and just spend time exploring, spend time mapping places, and trying to understand them, not just through math and models, but through developing our inner sense, our intuition sense of a place. And that's been an incredibly important part of the work and the projects that I've done. If I hadn't gone somewhere like this, that was fairly difficult landscape to work in, I wouldn't appreciate Robert Marshall's book as much, in which he describes mile-long hikes taking 3 hours because the landscape is so hard to walk across. And there's lots that can be challenging in a place like this. These are some photos of where I was. You're looking at my home for the summer. I spent 3 months living in that tent. I spent most days covered in mud and dirt and mosquito clothing, and the waders are because we were doing a lot of stream work and river crossings, and so we were constantly in waders. And I feel like the impression people have of science and scientists in the world is often something far different than what it looks like to be a field scientist in a remote part of Alaska. The studies were to understand where trees were establishing, and so I'm showing you a picture of a very young tree. That tree would not even be up to your knees. That tree would be more like mid-shin in height, and it's very young. It's only 50 years old. So the plants are growing there, the trees are growing in the tundra, but these aren't rapid processes of change. And when plants change, we know that soils change. And a big part of the studies that I do, and what I'm trying to understand and put in the context of resilience for our world, is how do plants respond to disturbance? How do soils respond to disturbance? What are the roles of all of what's on a mountain hill slope, whether it's here or in Alaska, contribute to the health of a watershed, and through that to the health of the people who live in that region? I put this slide in, and this is Antarctica. So we just jumped in time and in place. This is Antarctica, and it's part of that idea of change over time. The environment is going to change. It has always changed. Some change processes in our environment are really slow. The rate that this glacier in Antarctica has melted and moved off of that land, and the time that it will take for this land to have any grasses, any small flowering plants is going to be a really long time. Change of adding vegetation to a landscape in some places takes a long time. Change in adding vegetation or removing vegetation in other places takes a long time. So oftentimes people will say that the earth has always changed, and that feels to them like they can say we shouldn't be planning for the earth changing, we shouldn't be developing our resilience and understanding the context of resilience, but that the earth is always changing is the reason to be resilient. It's not a reason not to do this. And then we have to recognize that the rates are different. And that's a big part of the changes that are taking place on our planet right now, is much more rapid rates than the change in this landscape in Antarctica. Changes like what we saw in the summer of 2018. For all of us living in this region, there was a lot of smoke in the air. And I don't know for all of you, but for me, it wasn't surprising that there was a fire. There was so little snow that winter. Many people were worried about the health of the forests because of how little snow there was. We were concerned about boating season and agriculture having sufficient water, and the earth was dry. And that's not the only thing that's necessary and causes and leads to a large wildfire, but it's one of the environmental circumstances in which it's easier for a spark in forests that have been managed for fire prevention to have fuel and get going and carry it away. So what does a scientist do after there's a fire 10 miles from their home? We go there for a hike. And I have to say that I could barely contain myself to go hiking until San Juan National Forest opened up. Because if you remember from 2018, there was a closure on all of San Juan National Forest. I misunderstood that opening didn't mean everything was open. Opening was some parts were open and burnt parts weren't open. And I didn't figure that out until after I went up here. But so these are photos I shouldn't have taken, or maybe shouldn't be showing, because I went to this landscape. This is just up valley from me. And I've walked next to glaciers and ice so much and been present in that space where ice changes our planet. I wanted to be present soon after the fire to know what it's like when fire changes. And what you see are burnt trees. The nearest trees that you're seeing are all dead. And what you can't maybe get a sense of is that whole little drainage is full of ash. And this is so soon after the fire that it's before any erosion had happened. And so you can just look at that dense, thick ash layer from an intense burn. And I was sinking up to my knees in ash. And I hadn't really expected or understood how transformative fire is to a landscape and in creating that ash. And there's many reasons why ash then creates challenges for regrowth of a forest. And so I was curious about that too. But I didn't go up here because I wanted to see the burnt forest, the ash, and the charred earth. I went up here for this. Within 1 week, 2 weeks of a fire, a major intense fire coming through, this oak had already regrown to that size with that many leaves. I went up looking for where and how is this landscape resilient? What grows first? What grows fastest? How soon does regrowth happen? And every time I look for this, anywhere I go, I am amazed at how resilient our planet is. That life has a way of springing back up again. And that's at the core and the heart of resilience, is springing back up and having that ability to rebound. Now, this is kind of a lot, but hopefully I haven't overdone it for this. There's theory that underlies resilience. And since where and how and what's the value of having a college and academics in your community and in our region is that we've read things and we bring in big concepts from the literature, from the newest ideas that are out there, and we're trying to put pieces together of what we see happening within the context of what can happen and what's possible based on disasters happening in other regions. And so this is a general schematic of what happens as a result of crisis or disaster, and I've circled that in red, and that crisis or disaster usually happens after a phase where there's really constrained action, where we really feel like what we're doing is pretty good and we should just keep doing what we're doing. And it's in the moment of crisis that we face confusion, uncertainty. We start to dream in new ways. We start to question, why did we do things the way that we were doing them? And we re-envision what could happen. And then we move over into the left side of this diagram, which is the emergent action. Where and how do we network? How do we rebuild? And ultimately, this is an infinity symbol because that's a piece of resilience, is that we rebound and we move back towards that growth phase again. But in that creative networking, underneath that, you'll see that blue circle in choice. Where we are at after each crisis that our region faces, that our country faces, and that our world faces, is the opportunity to choose. And resilience is a part of resilience is being willing to change, to adapt, and to, in some cases, completely transform the way we do things and think of things in new ways so that we can move into a new growth phase that's not just following the growth phase we were in before. What people do with this diagram is they layer it in layers. So they do this diagram and they do the same thing again and again and again. And they show a positive trajectory of change over time where the new growth doesn't look like the old growth. The new growth is something different because of this transformative change that's possible as a result of enduring a crisis. When I went to DC to testify before the US Congressional Committee for Science, Space, and Technology, I brought 3 messages in my opening remarks. I said that we should be a resilient nation, we should be a good neighbor, and in that I meant as a nation in the world, we should be a good neighbor, but we can think about lots of ways that good neighbor could be characterized. Good neighbors within our communities, good neighbors across communities within our region, and that we should work towards a new narrative on climate change. My thinking there is that we've developed different narratives about climate change, and some sort of the big split is, you know, climate change is fine, the climate's always changed, no worries. And then there's the other side of the narrative, which is this is dramatic change and life as we know it is not going to continue. And there's an opportunity to, instead of developing 2 separate narratives, to work together on what's the common narrative and what do we want to have at the center of this. Do we want climate change at the center? Or do we want something else at the center? And I would argue, and the reason why I put the first one of these bullets in my testimony is that we don't put climate change at the center, because that may not be the first crisis we face. There's always going to be uncertainty about what the next crisis we face is. And resilience is important no matter what crisis it is, because if we went back to that previous diagram, crisis is a component part of where and how we think about transformative change in where and how we sustain ourselves. So Resilient Nation was there first, intentionally on purpose. And I did not know, and none of us knew, that we would at this time be staying at home with businesses closed in a growing economic crisis because of a virus. Resilience is at the core of the response to this crisis, and a crisis of climate, and a crisis of nature, and change in where and how we use resources. There's so many things that resilience sits at the center of. And so that brings us to where we are now, the summer of 2020. I chose summer as the season to highlight because that is when I do field work. I also think that in a lot of ways, summers define years for people. There's so much in a temperate region that happens in summer because we have the opportunity to go outside more and to connect and to interact more and grow our food and play. And it's going to be a really different summer this summer when there's a virus present and we're going to have to make some tough choices. And so I want to transition from what I've been talking about to where and what does it look like to plan, practice, be resilient in a summer with COVID-19. I promise this is the only other really complex slide that I'm going to show you. But again, this is um, where some folks, myself included, think in terms of can we more generally describe what cause and effect and cause and effect and cause and effect pathways look like? We want to be able to go from something like a climate driver or increase in change in wildlife human interactions. Some component of our environment that changes that leads to an exposure pathway that leads to health effects and that have consequences for vulnerable populations. And what I personally find helpful is that when I think and I organize ideas in this way, I can see when my logic doesn't make sense. And that's a big part of what we want to do if we want to understand why resilience is important. We want to understand where and how do we build resilience in this pathway of cause and effect so that ultimately that purple box at the end with vulnerable populations, we reduce the harm to vulnerable populations. The vulnerable population could be big, it could be small. The vulnerable population may be the old, it may be the young in some cases for certain kinds of environmental changes. It often, very often is lower income people who are in the vulnerable population. And because of huge inequities in our society, it is often people of color who are in the vulnerable population. And we're seeing those patterns currently for what's happening on the Navajo Nation and what's happening in African American communities across our country. So the examples that I put there are also to highlight, and those are those green boxes, are to highlight that a change like climate, temperature, or snowfall can change to earlier springs, drive earlier springs and longer growing seasons. And then the environmental hazard that can create is an increased abundance in pathogens. COVID-19 is not necessarily in any way directly related to the climate crisis. It's got many different drivers for what led to having this virus present right now. But what I think is important is to recognize that climate can change the abundance of pathogens. And so it's another reason that we can see increases in infectious disease in our world. So how do we keep vulnerable populations safe? This is how we do it. And so I want to give a shout out to local public health. San Juan Basin Health is the local organization that oversees public health for Archuleta County, as well as La Plata County, where I live. And they are behind the scenes. They are behind the scenes because they started working to plan for how to manage and slow the rate of a communicable disease in our region 4 weeks before most of us even knew it was here. We have an incredibly experienced group working at local public health. And one of the things that we can do is to share our gratitude. So I worked with Gaia Creative, which is a marketing and branding organization here in Durango. My friend Sarah Douglas is the primary designer there. And we developed these logos, and we're going to have them available on a website, on her company's website, so that anyone who wants to can download these logos and they can put it on their social media. They can put it on Resilient Archuleta can put it on your website. We can put it up in store windows as we start to have a gradual reopening of businesses in our town. We can print it on banners and hang it from fences. And I highlight all of these things because when there's a very visible fire and there are firefighters fighting a fire, keeping us safe, signs go up everywhere in recognition that the firefighters are in a mode to prevent human harm. And this group, our local public health, they're doing the same thing. And yet it's so much harder to see what they do because what they do is so much less apparent. They're having conversations, they're on the phone, they're doing interviews, and they're on the media. But in that stream, in that pattern that I showed you on the previous slide, how do we prevent harm to vulnerable populations? We can do that. And this is how we do that. once people are in a place of harm, we depend and count on our healthcare professionals that are at hospitals to take care of people, family members helping to take care of people who are sick. And that's also something that's a more visible, like the firefighters part. But where and how public health plays a role, I want to say I've never really realized this part of where you could have a job and where and how we plan for resilience until about 15 years ago when I was living actually up in Larimer County. And I joined the Environmental Health Board, which meant that I was directly interacting with the local public health up in Larimer County, and they're pretty amazing up there too. So I want everyone to take a minute. We're switching and transitioning. Certainly public health is full of resilient people. Take a minute and think about someone you know who is resilient. Picture them in your mind, and then think about why you think they're resilient. What behaviors do they have? How do they interact with you that increases your sense, your appreciation that they're a resilient person? We know, each one of us knows somebody who is resilient, and we have the traits and characteristics of being resilient too. And I think it's really important to recognize these traits in ourselves and to recognize them in others, because then we can make intentful choices to choose resilience and choose resilient behaviors rather than choosing behaviors that may come more easily, because it's easy to move into a space of worry, concern, and anxiousness, and wanting to stay in a space of holding on to the way things were rather than being willing to adapt and change. So just in case this might help, this is one graphic that I found online of characteristics of resilient people. They have a growth mindset. They think about their values and they work to have their actions aligned with their values, which is really pretty hard most of the time. It's not hard, but it is hard. People who are resilient have a high level of self-awareness. It doesn't mean they don't make mistakes, but they can see where and when and how they're making mistakes, and then they own those mistakes. Another part of resilience is having a positive perspective on experiences. We could say that that's turning lemons into lemonade, seeing the glass half full, but really it's just more reflecting at a fairly high level that something is hurtful and harmful, something is challenging, we're in crisis, but we can move to think about where and how can we learn from this moment. And some of us just do that intuitively, and some of us are working in that space of trying to grow that skill set because it's a harder one if we haven't had people who model those behaviors for us in our lives. And then we build resilience together. This isn't a solo activity. We grow our self-awareness, but we engage with others to continue to build our own self-awareness and to help others with growing their self-awareness. The reason I put this graphic here is that I went to the COP, the Conference of the Parties 25 in Madrid, that focused on the topic of climate change. And this is a word cloud that emerged from the different presentations and discussions and media that was being covered on the COP25. And this was just in December of 2019. And the thing that was so shocking to me about this diagram that maybe wouldn't jump out at you all is over to the right. Look at how big that word ecology is. So my training is as an ecologist. I focused on that ever since undergrad, with an emphasis on understanding the role of plants in element cycles. I never thought that at an international conference on one of the leading pressing issues of our world, ecology would be one of the words that comes up in the forefront of what it is. And I highlight that now because it ties into that together part. A huge critical piece of ecology isn't how species operate alone. It isn't how individual plants operate alone. It's not how individual deer operate alone. It's the together part. a big part of ecology is recognizing the interdependence, and in recognizing and understanding independence, increasingly growing and understanding that many species in this world are successful because of how they work together, not because of how they work in competition with one another. And so ecology at the center of an international meeting makes a lot of sense to me. So we grow our resilience together, and people need to be connected across air and watersheds. Sometimes we do that, sometimes we don't. The way I've been thinking about this is that if the air moves from one place to another, the water often flows in the opposite direction. And so our airsheds are often our watersheds, but not always. Airsheds tend to have a bigger reach than the watersheds sometimes. And it means we're sharing resources. We're sharing and connected by our environment. And so we need to be connected. We need to be connected to Farmington. We need to be connected to the desert regions of Arizona. Those are in New Mexico. Those are places that that will influence life in our region. And the choices we make in our region influence life for the people in those regions. We can work to grow the space to have conversations together, because that's ultimately key to resilience. And so what I included here are photos of me with other people, because I started with a picture for this talk of me in of a landscape with no people. And for me in 2000, when I was finishing my PhD in 1999 and in 2000, there was so much to learn about growing resilient in a space where I was afraid of big rivers, of wolves, of bear, of being remote. And that's a really different space, but those experiences of being so far back in the wild is what's helped me to be more resilient and be more committed to the engagement in these other spaces that include Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, working in China with Chinese scientists to understand the changes in that region and how they're similar to us, and increasingly going to DC to advocate for science and an increasing role in science-based decision-making. Ultimately, resilience depends on trust in science. And this is one of the big challenges we face. There's been a 40, 50-year effort to misrepresent science. And as scientists, we haven't necessarily done a good job or developed our systems in a way to balance those efforts, to recognize, see them, and challenge them. And we haven't developed allies in order to challenge those efforts either. And so oftentimes it's a really odd space to be a scientist in the world right now, because there are patterns of change I can see. There's my concern of harm to people that's to come and present right now with a virus. And there's also science as a path to the solutions for these things. And we don't necessarily, we need to shift this balance. We need to shift this balance back to where people can trust science and people know scientists rather than not knowing scientists. And I really value how much opportunity I've had to engage with our community while being here in the Southwest part of Colorado for 11 years. So I became a mountain scientist in 1993. This is my first summer, was at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab near Crested Butte, Colorado. And living remote, living in the mountains, I understood so much more than if I'd come to the mountains for just 1 week. I came for the whole summer. I went back and finished my undergraduate degree. And by the fall of 1994, I was enrolled at Boulder. And even though it's not the most advantageous thing for one's career, I committed myself to living in Colorado and to living in a mountain region of Colorado, rather than living somewhere else, because it gives me the opportunity to have conversations with you all and learn what you know, what you see, what you do, and how you're being impacted by the changes that take place in this region. And then we can build the stories of change and of the choices we have together. So many practices grow our resilience in our communities. One of the important practices to be resilient personally as an individual is to find ways, daily practices or weekly practices of expressing gratitude. So again, a shout out to local public health and a recognition that we've got a spot on the Gaia Creative website where you can download these logos, and we're hoping to spread the word far and wide and to have city government, county government put these up. We've also worked to create some of these for other counties and regions of our state, where my friend also works with public health. And ultimately for me, a piece of resilience is staying hopeful. That's that positive frame of mind. And I don't know how it works. I don't know where it comes from, but I'm hopeful that we will make good choices from where we're at now with ongoing climate change amidst a crisis of health and nature towards being a resilient nation, towards improving our role as a good neighbor in the world, and that we'll develop these new narratives together that are inclusive of more people and more perspectives. So thank you so much for hosting me. And with that, we'll shift to a question and answer phase.
Wonderful. Dr. Steltzer, that was amazing. Very inspirational. I really got a lot out of this. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just read a couple of these from the chat. From Holly, she says, she also thinks about the effect of increasing numbers of environmental refugees and how that will provide another exposure pathway.
Yes, Holly. I've been thinking about that a lot. And I'll be honest, my first reaction was anxiousness, because sometimes that's the first reaction. And that's because I had new neighbors move into the empty house next door. They moved in from Texas. They came now during COVID, and they weren't self-quarantining. And one of my friends was like, "Are you worried you're going to get sick because they live next door?" And, you know, they came from a region that had higher incidence of COVID. And I said, "No, I don't think it's going to jump across the fence or anything like that. That's not how viruses work." I was worried because of the community aspect of something like this, and that there are people working in our grocery stores, there are people working at our hospitals, and that we have and should have a commitment if we need to go somewhere new and we need to shift our location in some big way. We should be aware that self-quarantining is an important process to keep others safe. The mountains are refuge. That has been one of the new things that I've grown in appreciation of just this year and this winter. One of the things that was part of a policy briefing that the United Nations put out on mountain regions is that they're incredibly rich in resources, rich in species, rich in water, rich in so many resources. And it's that richness is there because they're refuge. And if they're refuge for all these other species, they're also refuge for us. And so a part of resilience is figuring out where and how do we allow for new neighbors? Do we be a good neighbor, allow for new neighbors, and help people become a part of the fabric of a mountain town and a mountain region? Because people will want to come. There is going to be a shift, and I'm really curious to see what the demographic shift looks like, not just for our country, but for other countries, of people who decide urban life isn't quite what they want anymore.
Very well stated. Herb Grover says, "Well done, Heidi." And so I also want to mention, you know, earlier you spoke of the tribal nations, and you know we are neighbors to them, and we want to be good neighbors, and you know that's a reciprocating effect there. One of the things that we have heard, and you know, again, it affects different populations in different ways. One of the things that we know is some cultures are so close that when grandma gets sick, they all pile in the car and they go to the doctor together. And then as soon as grandma's been seen by the doctor, they all get back in the car and then they go to the store together. And so, this is something, and it's a cultural thing for them, and for a lot of different nations, and not just the tribal nations, but for different ethnic and races as well. And so, I think that this is something that we all need to be aware of, that because, we are in this self-isolating situation, that we have to keep our physical distance from each other, that it occurs to me that, we can't, as a society, impose upon anyone. Right now it's our choice. We are being told to wear our facial coverings, but I feel that if we are out in our communities and we're not, personally, for me, I feel that if I'm not wearing that, I'm going to be socially judged. And so again, it's a matter of perspectives on how people feel about that, and how are we looking at being a resilient community together if we're not all participating in those efforts that we know to be keeping everybody safe, not just the individual, but for the people around us as well.
There are some big social factors at play for sure. And we very much in the frame of understanding resilience always recognize that it's human ecological systems. You can't pull the human out, because there are so few places that are just ecological systems not impacted by people. And that brings in the social sciences. And why do people make choices that they do? Culture influences those choices. And culture influences choices, whether it's everybody getting in a car or whether it's going to the state capitol to protest stay-at-home measures. What we have control over is what we do. And the Resilient Colorado framework that they put forward on where and how to inform our practices in this COVID time is that we shouldn't enforce behaviors on others or judge others. We have to choose for ourselves, feel that our choices are aligned with our values, and model behaviors for others without judgment of if they mirror the same behaviors or not. And I don't think that those are necessarily easy things to do. And where and when and how one person having their face covered and another person not can, instead of judgment, lead to conversation. If it can lead to, I can see you chose to wear a face covering. Can I know why? Why are you choosing to do that? It's the opportunity to understand why someone's making the choice they are. And that doesn't necessarily, if we can find the way to do that without judgment and without defensiveness and harmful, hurtful language, we have to do it in a way that says, I'm genuinely curious and I want to understand something I don't understand. That's a big part of resilience at the community level, is always being open to think, maybe I have assumptions and my assumptions are totally inaccurate. And so ask a question rather than make a statement is the way I've been trying to move in my practices.
That's great. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Steltzer?
Just an observation. Happened to be in Durango today and visited Home Depot and Walmart and had my face mask on and so forth. I would say I don't think I was in the majority. And I would say, given the number of people in both of those stores, I think they're both doing okay. In other words, they're not suffering like the small businesses, the restaurants and so forth. So the Durango community is I don't know, it was kind of unusual to experience that. And my wife and I noticed that most of the people who were unmasked were young people. In other words, the people who perceive themselves at the least risk, and apparently were least concerned about what masking up means for older people like myself. So that's just an observation that I don't know that there's anything to draw from that other than there are some people who do not feel vulnerable to the virus at this time.
I also think that past harm affects where and how what people have for coping mechanisms, and whether they would have as high a level of concern for harm. So it may not be that they feel that they won't be harmed. It may just feel like, so what if I'm harmed? And we have to recognize that that's often tied and linked to trauma. And that's one of the things that San Juan Basin Health is helping and working towards managing for, is where and how are some of the changes that are underway most impactful for people who are not in healthy mental health places. And so maybe that's also some of what influences face covering choices.
Yeah, and by the way, Heidi, you may have seen this, but we lost Sir John Houghton last week from COVID.
I did
I
see
don't know
that.
if you saw that in the news or not.
Yep. I did. It looks like we have one more question there.
Okay. It says, let's see. Can you expand more on the new narrative for climate change and where we should focus outreach efforts locally? Many people in Archuleta County do not believe in climate change.
Yeah, so thank you. I think that's a really good question. Wow, there's so many different levels. I feel like where I need to start is listening, because I don't fully understand the perspective of that it's not happening, and they're not. I want to be open to understanding where and how someone's arriving at that logic, and a piece of that, if I can be honest, is not so much it's that when someone is talking and they're sharing why they don't accept climate change, and they may be using the word, I don't believe in climate change, I am learning about them, and I'm learning what their values are. And that the next conversation and opportunity I have with those individuals isn't to follow up on to rebut their arguments. It's to ask them another question about the thing that I just figured out they value. So it's to find out that they really value hunting. It's to find out that they really would like bear to be more abundant in our region. It's to find out that lake life is important to someone, or having a healthy forest in their backyard is important to people. Having decreased risk of wildfire is important to people across our region. So it's an opportunity, by listening, to hear and then build a relationship with someone about where and how we have common values. And oftentimes when I'm doing that, I'll find that they're more ardent with some of their environmental practices than I am with my own. And so I feel like people put out these ideas of very strongly, and then you find out that they compost all the time, that they're just and there's a different underlying motivation for why they compost. But here's this shared thing that we could have conversations about together: where and how can you develop successful compost? And I've got to be honest, on the compost thing, I have a lot to learn from people who are better composters in our region than me. And too much of our food waste, when we have it, our organic waste, goes to the landfill. I just haven't found time to do that. And so that's the other piece that I feel like is important, is I'm going to be honest about the things that I would like to do better at. And I feel like it's important to say, I personally think systematic change is what's needed. Systematic change in politics, in economics, in industrial systems. But individual choices help empower us and help us be resilient. And so we also have to invest in those, even if they're only a piece of it. And I wish I was better at composting, but I haven't had the time to do it yet. And I hope that people will teach me in time, when I have time.
Well, we'll have a one-on-one if you'd like. So that's wonderful. And I'm seeing a lot of accolades for your presentation, and thank you very much. And I think we're expressing our gratitude to you, and we really do appreciate your time tonight. One question that I would like to ask, being a forester, and Herb's a forester, and we've got a couple of other people on the call that have forestry experience. I would like to know what kind of tree was that very small 50-year-old tree? I'm going to guess it was a fir tree from what I could tell.
So close. Take another guess. One of the other foresters needs to take another guess. Northwest Alaska, dominant tree.
Oh, spruce.
Yeah, is white
Okay.
spruce.
White spruce. Okay.
Yep. And black spruce would be down in the valleys, and white spruce is up on the uplands. And oh my God, the first time I aged one of those trees, I was just like, no, I cut down a 50-year-old tree that was like the length of my arm.
Wow.
And I, that's a piece of science. And, I feel like when we're honest and we're open and we admit the places that we're working on, sometimes people use that as an open opportunity to criticize others. And I've decided not to be concerned about that. If somebody wants to criticize me because I sometimes fly for work, because I do cut down old trees and old plants and collect plant material in order to study them, that's an opportunity for a conversation. We have to keep being open to that it's not fair that people criticize us for those things, and instead ask, could you say that another way? And I can't say that I'm perfect at doing that. It's kind of hard to be in that space when somebody's being very critical of you, but we have to not be afraid of it. And then ask and model the other behavior, of asking with the intent that we want to understand someone rather than be critical or judge them.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think those are really wonderful words to leave with. And again, we want to thank you for your time, your presentation, your inspiration, and just happy Earth Day, everyone. Enjoy it. And I think Heidi is leaving us with a lot of good guidance on what we can do to go forward with this. So thank you very much is what we're seeing in the chat box here.
You're so welcome. Thank you for hosting me. This was I had like 5 or 6 talks lined up this week. This is the only one I had. So,
oh my gosh.
Way to go.
Yeah.
On ensuring that something got pulled off. I'm really impressed.
Well, thank
All right,
you so
and
much.
I will get you the logo so that you can also upload that and have those available. And then if you can send me the link to this this presentation, I'll make sure to share it across Durango.
Wonderful.
Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And before everybody hops off, we do have another virtual event, which is How We Grow, that's put on by the GGP, and that is on Friday, April 24th at 6:00 p.m. So don't miss out on that.
Thank you, Ethan. Yes, absolutely. This is going to be an interesting virtual meeting or a movie watch. So grab your favorite bottle of wine or a bowl of popcorn and join us for that evening. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.